I'm Richard Simmons, Chief Executive of the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. We're the government's advisor on architecture, urban design and public space. And thank you very much for inviting me. First of all, just before I start what I was going to say, a couple of points really. First of all, I chaired a conference yesterday organised by the Architects Journal on sustainable design. Congratulations for having some women on the platform, Bioregional, because there were none there yesterday. And this becomes relevant when I get on to the next bit of what I want to say. Secondly, just to, CABE is also involved in designing the Olympics, and just to reinforce what Dan was saying, there is actually an organisation which has been set up called the Commission for Sustainable 2012. If you Google them, there's a lot of information about what's going on with them. And the other thing, answering the other question, the Olympic Park actually became cheaper once it was made more sustainable, because all the pipes were taken out and sustainable urban drainage was put in, and it then became affordable when it was not before. So, in fact, it doesn't always cost more to be sustainable. What I wanted to talk about very briefly, though, was I was looking before I came at what the potential messages were that were going to be coming out of the sessions we've just had. And there are a couple. The first one really is the one I want to major on, which is the question of commons. If you were a medieval peasant, of course, your feudal landlord would require a certain amount of labour from you. You'd also have a strip of land which was your own to farm, but then the community would share the commons, and that was shared by everybody, and there were rules and regulations and people to oversee the use of those commons. This is one that still exists. It's part of the legacy of that system near Beverley, and I'd like to thank whoever took this photograph and put it on the web, because as part of the global commons of the web, I'm able to show it to you today. My point being really that a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of what we've just been hearing about, particularly at One Brighton, I think, but also at the Olympics as well, is about those things which are held in common by all of us. And ultimately, that's the planet, isn't it? And it's the resources that we have. You can tell I'm a Jared Diamond fan, but I think it's absolutely critical that we start to understand this issue. And the reason for that is because, at the moment, I think a lot of the fundamentals of the economy and the way the government works don't quite recognise it. I've got another photograph just like Dan's, actually, but in our case we were putting a pylon up because earlier this year in Birmingham, with the City Council and others, we ran a climate change festival, which sounds like a strange thing to do, doesn't it? The reason we did that is based on some work by many people, including Mori, however. Mori published a report last year, and they asked people who they thought could deal with climate change, and 80% thought it was the government, and 76% thought it was industry, and 61% thought it was their local council, 44% thought the community locally could do something about it, and only 27% thought it was me. I don't mean me personally, I mean them. Although, of course, most of them thought it was me, actually. The point being that we really need some common purpose here, I think. We need to understand the point about commons as being something more than a place where you grazed your cattle in the past. We need to really start thinking about what is held in common and what is shared. And I work in the public sector, and I'm getting a bit fed up of being in the public sector, not because I don't like it, but because we're the bad guys. We're the people who take all the money that the good guys in the private sector make, and then we lose it somehow. Now, actually, we're not the public sector. We're not a sector of the economy. We are the commons managers, as are people in the third sector, and some people in the private sector as well. So we need to understand that there is stuff which is held in common which we need to share. And I thought that came through in several of the presentations. But for me, critically, it was about One Brighton and the way in which One Brighton is thinking about involving people in the management of the place, not just the people who live there, actually, but a broader group of people. And I'll come back to that in a second. So that, for me, was a key theme. Also, what we're talking about today is about carbon. So I also wanted to just think briefly about some of the messages about how we plan and create the places that we live in, because I'm from an organisation that does that kind of thing. This is Hammarby Sjöstad in Stockholm, which many of you will know. It's a reasonably sustainable suburb. It's been designed to be sustainable. And one of the key factors about the sustainability is that the energy systems were actually built in from the start, as indeed were the waste management systems, to be sustainable by the local authority along with the green infrastructure. And again, there was something there, and we see this again, particularly in One Brighton, but also in the Olympics as well. We just heard about that too. There's something there about making provision up front and investment in the future. And that investment, I think, is critical. And it's very important to see it that way. The one argument I might have with the Olympics project is a discussion about legacy, because coming back to the question about how many women are on the platform, coming back to the question about who feels that they're engaged in this process or not, why it's no more than 27%, we've just been doing some work on our equality strategy, and the question we came up with actually is this for me or not for me? And you can use that question in all sorts of places, about the design of loos, about design of access to buildings, but in this context, is it for me or not for me? Is the Olympics for me or not for me? Legacy is not for me. Legacy is for people a long way in the future. And sadly, most people are not that virtuous. They want to know what's in it for me. So I like the word investment, because I think investment is for me. Investment, I can see how an investment could pay off for me in my lifetime, and it might pay off for my kids as well. So it seems to me that when we look at places like Hammarby, when we look at the projects in the Olympics, we see investment, and that investment for the future is critical. It's also true actually about the supply chain, that the more we invest in more sustainable products, the longer things are going to last. And finally, I wanted to take slight issue with Sunand, because I actually agree with Sunand about almost everything we've ever talked about. But it's about prediction, really. We've been talking a lot about carbon, that's the theme of the day. But for me, a critical issue is what we do about the fact there's already an awful lot of carbon in the atmosphere. Because if you read a book by my friend David Orrell called Apollo's Arrow, he's what's called a disruptive intellectual, and he's written a book, he's written several books. Apollo's Arrow is about the science of prediction, and the fact that actually it's impossible at the end of the day to predict exactly where we're going to end up on climate change. We can describe what's happened very well through the models that we've got already. We can look at the past, we can dig up the ice and find out what's gone wrong. We can give ourselves a general direction of travel, so we know that the planet is hotting up. But no scientist, and this is for complex mathematical reasons that I haven't got long enough to bore you with now, scientists actually cannot tell us where we're going to end up. So we need to actually have a risk management strategy towards climate change, and this is where I come to green infrastructure. Because green infrastructure is to some extent about carbon, and it may be that Sunand's right that a carbon-based economy will give us more green infrastructure. But this is really much more about survival. It's about places that can cope with dramatic weather events. It's about places that can survive getting too hot, too cold, too wet. And it seems to me that in this conversation, and I imagine actually that given that we were both on the Ecotowns Challenge panel, and I rabbited on about this constantly, you're now very bored, but actually if we don't think about places holistically, it's absolutely critical. So my final point really is abolish the red line, and this is what I was really pleased to hear about at the Olympics and at One Brighton, because most definitions of zero carbon at the moment are based on the site, they're based on the red line and what happens within that. And in fact, what we're seeing at One Brighton is the intention to spread out beyond that to serve the existing community, the existing buildings, the existing neighbourhood. The Olympics is doing the same thing. And it seems to be absolutely critical that we recognise that energy is a common issue, green infrastructure is a common issue, and above all, I think, our investment now is a common investment that we are making for ourselves now and for the future. Thank you very much.